Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this lovely evening and choosing to be inside. I know we're kind of in that in-between time where the weather is maybe too nice to be inside, so thank you for giving your evening and being here with us. My name is Lauren Medici. I'm the Director of Engagement Programs at Opera Omaha, and I am delighted to welcome you to our first of 3 Opera in Conversations for the Marriage of Figaro. This production is a long time coming for us. This is our last COVID-delayed production that we're so excited we'll finally see the Orpheum stage at the end of March. So before we get started on tonight's conversation, a few reminders about the series. Our next conversation next week will be about the art of comedy with community partners, Big Canvas Improv Theater. And as an important note, we will be at the Blackstone Theater, which is their space in Blackstone, so we will not be here. There's a play rehearsal here, so if you come and bust in the door and we're not here, head over to Blackstone and we'll see you next week for that. As well as our Artist Response Opera in Conversation will be April 4th. So I hope that you will take what you hear tonight, what you experience at the opera, and then come back and be in conversation with us on April 4th. A note about microphones. There will always be time for questions. This is called Opera in Conversation for a reason. We invite you to ask questions, to converse with each other, to converse with us. If you have a question, we'll pause and Pat will come around with a mic in the audience, and that's because we're live streaming tonight, and so this will be on YouTube after the fact if you just had a nugget of information and you missed it and you want to go listen to it later, or you want to share with someone else. But the microphone's important so that that live stream also picks up your very intelligent and thoughtful and wonderful question. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers. You have bio sheets in front of you, so I'm not going to read a bio for each of them, but we are delighted to have both of them back at Opera Omaha for this production of The Marriage of Figaro. I have Stephen White and Dean Anthony, our conductor and our director for this fabulous production. Our first question for the night, as we think about your team and your process and this show that you're doing, is I want to start a little bit with inspiration. And as an artist and working on this wonderful piece, where does inspiration start for you when you're thinking about a production?
Sure, I'm going to repeat myself. I've said this almost every time I talk. Hi, everyone. By the way, it's great to be here. I always come back to this because it really does have a lot of truth for me. Coming back to Marriage of Figaro, I've done it many, many times, both as a performer and as a director. It is just like coming back to an old friend. And that old friend is that as soon as you hear it, as soon as you start to work on it, it's just like you were together 5 seconds ago versus 2 years, 5 years. But that intimacy of the piece, and I hear the first notes that play, and there's this heartwarming breath that happens in your body, even in the overture for me. So for me, it's just that understanding of how beautiful this piece is in its full entirety, from point A to point Z. You know the track you're going to take. You know the games they're going to play. You know how it goes, and it just is such a joy. So as far as artistic energy, it just happens immediately, just from the music the composer wrote. You should talk about that.
I agree. I mean, as a classical musician, I don't take for granted the fact that I get to spend my life working with masterpieces. The last time I was here, I was at Eugene Onegin, masterpiece. Before that, Cozy, masterpiece. So I feel sorry for people that don't have that opportunity to spend their lives with masterpieces. And Marriage of Figaro, in particular, it has to be so rewarding for everyone involved with the piece because it challenges singers vocally, it challenges singers dramatically, but it challenges, in the best possible way, our the combination of our brains and our hearts. That's the thing that, to me, Mozart is more than anybody else. Great composers do this routinely, but Mozart was always about balancing the brain and the heart, the sunshine with the with the clouds. I mean, just today we were working with the recitative that begins before the great aria Dove Sono, and we just said to ourselves, this could be a tragedy. Here we are right in the middle of perhaps the greatest comic opera ever written, but at this moment, what he does is he brings real pathos to the role of the Countess. And so the endless inspiration of a masterpiece like Marriage of Figaro is almost biblical. And I don't mean to be sacrilegious in any way, but other than the fact that when you have a sacred text, you keep going back to it and you learn more from it. That's how I feel about the Marriage of Figaro. So inspiration is there, and it never leaves.
Right, and if I can jump on that really quickly, the other aspect about that, working on that piece that we were working on today, this morning, Mozart gives us time to breathe when we need to breathe. And so that we can breathe and take in this information in this beautiful arc of music, but really in the slower sections of this piece compared to the fast, because it does move very, very fast. The slow sections are the truth and the often painful experience these characters. So he gives us the time we need to register and feel that through his music. And then, of course, when it's all running around, everybody's running around, the tempo creates that as well. So you have those fast and delightful little moments, but then he slows down. So he really takes care of us, if that makes sense. He takes care of you through the journey of this piece. And really all we, I believe, have to do is trust the material and trust it and honor it, as you were saying, and we're in good hands.
Exactly.
Can you talk a little bit about that balance of honoring and working with something that is sacred and is so well known, but also giving it space and working with it as a living thing?
Well, let me talk about it from a musical standpoint. I'm one of these people who we all talk a lot in the music business, particularly with early music, about authentic practice. And I'm all for authentic practice. I'm all for knowing everything that we need to know about how something was performed, or whether the trill starts on the upper note, or what the tempo might have been, or what pitch we were supposed to have been. But in reality, authenticity to me, which is to say respect for the document, boils down to how it is manifests itself in appropriateness. So to me, the A word that I'm always trying to achieve is appropriateness, which incorporates as much authenticity as possible. But there are times where, and Mozart would absolutely slap me on the back and say, "Thank you for saying this, my brother," because Mozart was a man of the theater, and everything that he did when it comes to his operas is about, yes, I mean, he created the most sublime, academically perfect music that has ever been written, but at the same time, extremely flexible. When you look at some of the notes that he would write about his singers, and this person couldn't sing it well, so he'd change something, or this person couldn't sing it well, so he'd give him a different role, or they just cut it out completely. So it is understanding the practicality. And so with each theater that you would do something in, this is going to be different in the Orpheum than it would be in a different kind of theater. With each singer that you use, with each orchestra that you use, you try to find, what I try to find is the appropriateness, and I have sort of an aesthetic ideal from a musical standpoint that I'm working for, and that ideal is to try to let the music and the drama and my singers speak with intentionality at every single note, so that not a single note is wasted, not a single gesture is wasted, not a single thought that runs through a character's mind is wasted, which is one of the reasons working with this man is such a joy, because he feels the same way, and I believe, and it's evident.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have any issues in rehearsal, which is a delight. Do we? So no. We get along very well, and I completely understand Maestro's aesthetic. And what kind of sometimes shocks singers when they're working with me is I spend as much time between the phrases and the music that is not being sung, because the clarity that Mozart gives us in the score is all the new information that singer's going to go hit comes in between. So the tempo of that and the thought process of that, it rides in the same way. And so sometimes singers don't think of what's going on in between. There's a long passage. How fast is it? What's the dynamic? All those elements. And I have a lot of physical movement that is created by those things because is a, dramaturgically, whatever. I want the singer to be on stage to make the music happen. So I want it to come out of their bodies as if they're making the music happen. Because that can be a big difference. If the music happens and then they do something, it's not together. So there's a lot of work, and it really does turn into a dance for me. If you think about it, it's got a dance quality and almost a choreographic quality. And then we find how we can soften that and make it a natural movement. Because when Mozart's so clear that as people watching, you want to see it and just let it flow, no matter what the tempo is. So honestly, the movement's going to go in the tempo that Maestro takes. So whatever he does, that's going to ride the tempo. But it works very well together. And that's the beautiful thing about what we do is that Maestro needs me, I need Maestro, we need the singers, we need the orchestra. So it's this incredible combination of all of us trying to make this happen.
To me, one of the things that I like to say when people ask me, how can you put your role as a conductor into layman's terms that they could maybe identify with? And I think this would apply, to Dean as well. I said it's a little bit like being a manager of a baseball team. I'm not hitting the home runs. I'm not stealing the bases, but I'm trying to give my team, which includes the orchestra, which includes the singers, which includes everyone involved, I'm trying to give them my best effort and putting them in a position to succeed. And sometimes that requires great specificity. Other times it requires a little bit allowing these people to be themselves. But it's a great joy to be in that position, recognizing that we're not dictating anything. We are, in a certain sense, managing, hopefully with inspiration, a team.
You talk about the concept of this team. You both mentioned the importance of ensemble and what that is for you in this piece and how central that is. Can you talk a little bit about why you feel so strongly about the importance of that in this piece?
Well, for me, I think the important aspect of an ensemble, it is an ensemble piece. I mean, and the way Mozart has it, the trajectory of the piece is what it is, and we know that. But for example, if you look at Act 2, how the Act 2 finale, which is the longest finale I think in the repertoire, is because it goes on and on and on, but how it circles as each actor comes in and it gets more intense. The clarity of it is really, really there, and it's exciting, and it builds and it builds and it builds, and then someone else comes in and they become a part of that. But nothing stops. That's the beauty of it for me. It doesn't shut down when somebody new comes in. So the arc of it rolls, it snowballs, and that's what he does. But if you get to the a tutti contenti at the end, the build up to that moment is just one of those things. But it then changes and softens, and the a tutti contenti. But each singer is singing, and they're all reacting to the same text, really kind of for the first time in a way, and that just gives you this breath of. It's just, it's incredible. I don't know if I made any sense. But
you make perfect sense. I mean, to me, the word ensemble is the most beautiful word that we as musicians, it's the most beautiful concept that we as musicians are able to understand. And particularly for a conductor's entire raison d'etre. There's no need for a conductor without the concept of ensemble, and because it means together, and that's the whole thing. That's why I'm here, so that we can be together, not just beating time together, but hopefully creating the same arc of our own emotional journey to make the same aesthetic, and that's why. The rehearsal process is so valuable because it's not just simply a matter of, we know our parts, we're going to show up, we're going to be told where to go. But the process of our learning together how this particular Susanna reacts to that particular Figaro, who reacts to that particular Count, and in this particular process that might be completely different than the last time you were working in this particular company, that's ensemble. And that's what I love about the process more than anything. I mean, I know that there are some conductors that don't like the staging process. To me, I find the greatest joy in it. And I learn something new about a piece of music and about conducting and about making music and life. All the good stuff happens in rehearsals where we're trying to create this ensemble, and then we pray to God and hold our hands, and we hope it translates to the audience in performances.
You know, I also think it's interesting, if I may, you know, I get to be a part of that ensemble for the rehearsal process. And then they kick me out.
I can't imagine that. I mean, that just breaks my heart.
And that's the hardest thing in the world for me, is that I just have to step away from the car and let them have their show. And it really, I have to turn it over to you, because he's the boss then, and he's going to control the trajectory of that storytelling. So, but I do get to sit in the back and watch.
So for those who might not know, what is this time frame that you're talking about where you step away from the car? Does that, you know, are you talking about when
I
it
never
moves in the
really
theater?
step away from the car, because my brain always stays in it. But, you know, when we go into Tech Week and we put it on stage and we, you know, to shift the set around, and we get the set, we get the costumes, we get lights. So the fascinating part of my job in the theater is that every day there's a new added element. And it's wonderful to see the process, because they walk on the stage for the first time, and then the next day they try it with lights, and then we do all that massive work in the theater, which it's massive. And then you get to walk in and see the final product. But what it takes to put that together is stentorian. It's an incredible amount of work and an incredible amount of people, and I give massive credit to the technical staff and all the people involved on that side. And I get to be a part of that, which is a joy. But, you know, once we get to, you know, orchestra dress and the orchestra steps in, which is another layer we add on top of that, I sit back and I just watch the whole thing, and the company people are there, and we watch it and we see if there's problems. But that's when we start to slow down and walk away. And by final dress, we pass it over, really. And then relish the work that's taken place.
That's great. Dean, I wonder if you could talk a little bit, going back to the theme of inspiration, about how your experience as a singer and an actor in that space inspires your work as a director, and what you think about as priorities, or your style.
Oh, thanks. That's a cool question. Well, I come from a performing background, and I was a character artist or a character tenor. So my whole life, I called myself the ultimate sidekick. So I was never the big star guy. I was always the best friend or the comic guy to the side on that. You know, I was always a secondary guy. But my job in that role was always, as an actor, was always to give presence and give that person all my energy, all the focus, all the joy or the concern. So my energy was always shooting somewhere else. I might have a few lines here and there, but it was always going back. So when I stumbled onto directing, you know, 18 years ago, someone just said to me, "Hey, you should direct." I went, I never thought about it. But what I realized is that by being that sidekick, when I stepped into the directing, I just made everybody on stage the sidekick. So I just was able to take that musical background that I had, knew where the music was, I trusted the music and what the composer gives, and they do set you up for where the energy should be. So when that person's singing their aria or singing their moment, everybody's focusing on them. So what that does for me is that it guides the audience. So I want the audience to be able to watch, and then I see movement over here, and then they sing. And then they sing over here. So the physical movement of what happens in this, and it sounds kind of silly, but in rehearsal, what do I call it, Maestro?
Wax on, wax off.
You've seen Karate Kid? You know, when they do wax on, wax off, and if you think about that, it's, you know, the text goes here, but then somebody's response, because they understand, starts here. So that liquidness of that movement is something we can register, so we naturally go to it. So what I try to do is make it effortless for the audience to watch a show. because it always was hard for me to imagine somebody singing and I don't know where it's coming from as an audience member. That's kind of jarring. And
I would have a feeling that for many artists that work with Dean, they come away from the experience knowing their roles more thoroughly, knowing the piece more thoroughly than they ever thought they would. I mean, I can't imagine, because you will know the piece very thoroughly by the time you're through with this. And it's very easy, particularly for young singers, to, to learn their roles. But there are sometimes even there are whole acts where your character is not in that act, but you need to know what's happening there. And so, like I say, I greatly appreciate the thoroughness with which you really do everything.
vice versa. Thanks.
So, thinking about what your collaborative process looks like, it's very clear that you two have a great rapport and a great working relationship. But how do you create that? How do you collaborate together to really make a space and make a rehearsal space and get what you need to get done in this amount of time you have leading up to the
Honestly,
show?
I would say we just needed our first 3-hour session of work in a room together. Honestly, to me, I think that we found out almost immediately that we could get each other in that first rehearsal or two.
I felt that way, and trust, I think, is a big deal. I mean, I've had the privilege, of course, I assume in your bio of Dean, you know that he is the head of the Brevard Opera Company, and to see him work with young people and the folks that come through, talented but young, but to see, I'm talking about this thoroughness and this inspiration that he has. I've done 25 performances of Carmen at New York City Opera years ago, and I've conducted all over the place. The best Carmen by far I ever saw was Dean's Carmen with young people, and I'm talking about every single chorister engaged, and so to experience Dean with that kind of a result, and to experience the fact that these small things that seem small on the page matter, that to me gives me great trust, because the small things matter to me musically as well. I mean, I use all my own orchestra parts. I mean, I spend hundreds of hours preparing my own orchestra parts in case it helps me save 10 minutes in a rehearsal. But also to let the orchestra know, the totality, as much as I possibly can codify it into my ideas. So Dean does the similar kinds of things in his work. So I think we both appreciate our level of preparation, and then there's just a vibe that we share aesthetically. And he likes kilts, I like velvet. I mean, so.
Well,
What better
yeah.
pairing could you have?
On top of that would just be, we quickly found out that we trust each other. And I trust, and I value so deeply the detail that you bring to the score. And even, we've never done Figaro together, but there were a couple places where you were doing a little mojo and a couple things, and I'm like, oh, really? And I just listened to it, and I went, okay, how's that going to affect the way I move my, it's a little different. I didn't go, why are you doing that? Right. I went, oh, okay. And then just yesterday.
And vice versa, yeah.
Yeah, we were doing something. Can we slow that down? Tried it. And we found this really cool moment with the end of the sextet. That's just really, really great. And trust me, you can't do that with every vice versa. You know what I mean? It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes it's, what did I say in rehearsal today? Sometimes you'll be working and a conductor will go, no, 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 no. So you have to be really sensitive to that. But Stephen and I don't have to worry, which is great, because we know we're going to have that relationship, which takes that whole element out of our working process.
Right.
So we know we can get right to the task at hand with the actors. Yeah.
Stephen, can you talk a little bit, when we were preparing for this, you were talking about what your process is to get kind of into the music, and how that is sometimes impacted by what a director does, or how you visualize a piece.
Well, that's true. There's this disconnect, I think, from people's perception that the conductor's in charge of the music, and sometimes you'll read a review and they'll talk about the entire piece, and if the conductor is mentioned at all, it'll be the conductor, had good or bad tempos or whatever. I mean, it doesn't matter, and that's what but they don't realize that when I'm preparing a piece for the first time, in particular, I have an absolute dramatic idea of what I think should be on the stage. I actually do see Scarpia enter left and Tosca enter right. As I'm doing this, that doesn't mean that they have to, but if I don't have a visual in my own mind, I work out of visuals. If I don't have something like that, then I have a difficult time coming to what I think is the dramatic impetus of the music, which I think is what it's all about. And the good thing, and Dean's already sort of said this in other words, Mozart in a way directs his operas by himself. And by that I'm not talking about interstage right, interstage left, or hold this in that hand or whatever, but I'm talking about the things that really matter, which is to say what the dramatic and emotional impact of the piece is. Just the details that he has in dynamic marking. I don't know any other composer. In fact, I stopped the rehearsal yesterday or this morning, can't remember, it all flows together, and say, I mean, has there been any other composer who outlines the rhythmic impetus of a piece with dynamics? I'm talking about forte pianos and then crescendi. It is unbelievable, and the emotional content that you gain just from the music forms a dramatic ideal for me. So when I show up with a director, I'm not showing up there as a blank slate at all. I don't think it would be serving the artist with whom I'm working if I showed up with a blank slate dramatically. And it works the other way around as well. But
yeah, I mean, if I may, really quickly, I mean, how many cadences, are in this show?
150.
Somebody could just say that happens, and to me, that's a dramatic. It's not the end of a scene; it's the end of a beginning of a scene. So you can leave that for nothing, but to me, it has to be used or has to be done, or even rhythmically, how you open the door and shut the door in a rhythmic structure, but that this makes sense, so that you're watching the action and it just tickles in your head. But it's fascinating, right brain, left brain, different types of people. And sure, I sang, and I'm somewhat of I think I'm a musician, but I'm not anywhere. But if you laid a conducting score in front of me, it actually gives me, I get scared at it. I mean, how they, what? I mean, how many? There's 55 lines there, or whatever, and I would panic. So that's the thing, is that I can't make any sense out of that, but I don't have to. So I know he's going to, because I have one line to look at on my page, and then what's underneath it. Yeah. Then I can figure that out. So that's the beautiful part, is that we can't do it without each other.
Correct.
I wonder, both of you have a lot of experience working with both comedy and tragedy and different genres. How does your process or does your work change if you're doing a comedy or if you're doing a tragedy?
Dean can talk a lot about this. I will simply say that the nature of the two differences that I notice more is that comedy can tend to be more episodic. And I don't mean that negatively necessarily, but we go from one scene, it doesn't mean things don't build, but you go from one funny scene to another funny scene to something more funny, to something unbelievable, and then, oh, are you kidding me? I'm not talking specifically about Marriage of Figaro, I'm just talking about comedy generally speaking. Whereas, more lyric and more tragic or more dramatic pieces, let's take La Boheme, for example, or something. La Boheme has so much comedy in it, but there's this overriding arc of that develops in a way that is, to me, slower. I mean, I find that doing Rigoletto, of course, it's a lot of action, but I'm just talking about it builds in a slower kind of way. Just in terms of my preparation, finding those through lines, and then particularly if you've got a situation with Mozart, and in many comedies, Rossini, just sort of that opera buffa style, you have all the secco recitativo, which interrupts, and I don't mean that pejoratively, but it interrupts the musical flow line, and so that's those big differences.
You know, it's fascinating when you asked that, and I was listening to you, and to me, there's no difference. I mean, for me, because I tend to direct two kinds of shows, funny and dirty. That's what I tell people. I direct funny opera and I direct dirty opera, which is just gritty. I do a lot of gritty kind of work. And it really does fall into what I did as a performer as well, because that's the kind of stuff I was good at. So it makes sense that I ride that wave in the directing thing. But when it's really about tempo, you know, the tempo of what you're dealing with, that really controls where you're going, whether it's a tragedy or a comedy. And don't forget that every comedy has major conflict in it, or it wouldn't be funny. Because if you took all the tragedy, you know, you're just looking at a stand-up routine. You know, if you take out the conflict, it's just, there's nothing there. So if you look at it in the same way, it's, you know, there's problems that are going on in Marriage of Figaro that are concerning, but it's how Mozart treats it that there's the way to get in and out of those things. So you just got to trust what the composer did. And I will be perfectly honest. I am not one of those people who thinks, let's go against the grain of this to try to prove something or make it different or put it. I just don't feel I'm qualified or have the right to do that with a piece like this. So I am going to stick to the plan, what's on the page, in just about every opera that I do.
And just adding on to that, yes, I mean, when you're talking about, you know, not being different I'm just sort of really more analyzing the pieces themselves, but the process is the same. And as a matter of fact, you know, people will ask me, what do you specialize in? And I say, great music, great art. Yeah. And I'm not going to say that just because I can conduct Puccini doesn't mean I can't conduct, you know, an authentic practice, you know, Ariodante the next morning. I mean, I believe that we as musicians have to be able to do that. And there might be some things that I might prefer, but one of the great experiences of my life was conducting a La Boheme one night in Virginia, and then driving all night to conduct a Marriage of Figaro on Saturday afternoon in New York. Oh, how could you go from La Boheme to Marriage of Figaro? I said, well, and this was a singer I was talking to. Well, remember that you did a senior recital and you opened up with you know, a Handel aria, and then by the time you got to the end of the recital, you were singing show tunes. I mean, no, we're adaptable musicians, yeah. and it's just, and I always want to serve the score the exact same way. So specialization is something I try to avoid.
Well, and if I might jump on that, I mean, 2 weeks ago, Stephen and I were doing a very deeply heavy, tragic type piece, you know, very intense and very, very completely different than this. But we're both the same in the room, and the same process happened. And my production of that is very detailed and but so is this in its own way. So I mean, we're able to do the same type of thing in any kind of repertoire. I believe, you know, at least that's the way I would approach it.
Wonderful. You talked a lot about this tempo and this timing, and you mentioned a little bit with comedy and the time and tempo. This opera is all things that are happening within 24 hours. Mm-hmm. And you have some real pace that you got to maintain throughout. Can you talk a little bit about what you do for that pace and for that energy and over the course of the opera?
Well, you know, thank God for lighting designers. They can change the palette of the room as we see that go from daylight to. But I think, you know, for me, you know, the piece starts off and everything's going to be great, you know, and so it's the music is set up at a very early morning type style after the overture. So it's built in.
We do get a full day.
A full day, yeah. You know, so I don't really think about what the 24-hour period is, because you can't speed up a day and you can't slow down a day. but you just take each moment as it is. And I think that the really great thing about this piece is the recitative that happens. You can get a lot of information out very, very quickly with the urgency that we have to deal with these things. And so recitative, to direct recitative, you really got to not be in the way, but you got to be in the way. So you have to be really careful how you direct them in recitative, or it gets stodgy and they don't have the sequence. And so you just let them talk, because basically it's just a conversation. And some of these conversations are going fast because somebody's coming down the hallway and you got to get them in a closet, or you got to push them here, or you got to run them here. So that is a part of the choreography, the wax on, wax off that we're doing. And you have to tell them how I want to do it. So we spend a lot of time line by line, slow down. And I'm always having to say, wait, don't get ahead of me, because it's so easy for them to have a conversation no matter what they're doing. So it's actually just a blast. It's such a fun time to be in the room. And I think the great thing about it, too, from my point of view, is when you work on Act 1 and you get a group of new people in the room, and I know almost everybody in this cast, so they already know how I work. 1 takes a little bit longer when there's new people, but then 2 is a little faster. By the time you're in 3, everybody gets your style, and we're going, and Act 4 is done. So that's the beautiful part about it, is everybody starts to get there. They understand how he's going to go. They can, they know they're not going to come in and just stand there and sing something. They know they're going to have to move. So I've seen that in the last 2 days, and it's such a delight. And we get it done, and we have fun, and we enjoy our work.
So you've mentioned, this process, and it sounds like the rehearsal room for this opera especially is very fun. You've been in rehearsal for a little over a week. Have there been any discoveries or kind of big aha moments that either of you have had in this rehearsal process?
I wouldn't say there have been any aha moments, other than the fact that I have chills, goosebumps on my arms, every 15 or 20 minutes, and I'm not making that up. I'm not one to exaggerate, but seriously, because I think, to me, it's thrilling to see the way our really wonderful cast is responding to Dean's ideas and to my ideas, and how they're making them their own. That doesn't always happen. That doesn't always happen with a cast, particularly in an ensemble kind of way, where everyone, I think, is feeling the same kind of energy. That in and of itself is a fairly rarefied phenomenon. You don't always get to have that, and so to me, that's been a great joy. Was today. It's been that way every single day.
So there hasn't been any major aha moments, but the way I see in my brain, which most people shouldn't get in there because it's full of, almost 40 years of doing stage work. But I really I see this show as a movie in my head. So I see how it goes. And what I love about it is the fact that there are new people in my movie. So as I'm going through this, I'm seeing that movie with the different human being and the different colors that they can bring to it. And some are good, some are, let me shift that color, but that's just the beauty of it. And just seeing it the story being told in my head through another person's eyes and expression and voice, it's magic. It's really magic,
So I now want to kind of open it up to our audience for questions. As you can see, I could keep asking all the questions all night, but that's no fun. So I'll open it up. If you have a question, raise your hand. Pat will come around with a mic.
oh, there's a question.
You both were so good, I almost don't have a question, but there's something I've been mulling over. Can you talk a little bit about what makes a masterpiece? You talked earlier about the heart and brain connection, and I think I know I have that when I listen to classic operas, but when I'm open to contemporary opera, but I don't get that same feeling. The whole thing sometimes sounds to me like all recitative. I have my I have a hard time putting my finger on something I would call a beautiful aria, whereas with a masterpiece, is it the passage of time, or what goes into designating something as a masterpiece?
That's a brilliant question. That's a brilliant question, and because the answer to that, if there actually is an answer, is enigmatic at best and long at worst. But one of the things I would say about a masterpiece, there can be masterpieces that no one knows are masterpieces or aren't even considered masterpieces. So I would say that a masterpiece lives in two different worlds. Let's just say that is a piece that is considered a masterpiece, and then the piece that is and no one knows it is for whatever reason. About Marriage of Figaro, for example, both Da Ponte and Mozart were setting about when they composed this piece, not because they were trying to prove a point, but because their spirits opened up to themselves and they realized, here, there's this comic form, we can do more with it than has been done up to this point. And Da Ponte himself talks about that and the joy that he had working with Mozart. And you mentioned the Act II finale. The Act II finale, which is, this is a numbers opera in the sense that there's this movement and there's that movement and that movement. The Act II finale is one of the longest single movements of music written to that point. Usually you'll have movements of this thing and then that, but Mozart was able to, along with Da Ponte, to stretch this out. Now, would that make it a masterpiece? No, that's just a little thing. But what makes it a masterpiece is that move, the entirety of the action that happens, it builds flawlessly, seamlessly, and in a way that the moment you think that it's come to a conclusion, something else happens, and it's unbelievable from just a form standpoint. Okay, we'll check that box off. Great form, but then the quality of the music and how it grabs you. It's the type of thing that you can't really define. Mozart used the same Alberti bass that Clementi used and that others used and Haydn used and Gustav Mahler once said that all music is built out of the same building blocks. But not everyone's a great architect. Everyone can go grab a brick and a piece of cement, but not everyone can take that brick and piece of cement and do something. And so looking at it in terms of form and then looking at it in terms of how it touches you in the heart, you could go on and on about what makes it a masterpiece. But I would say that there are any number of new pieces of music that I think may be at some point considered masterpieces, and as they make their way through the years will be considered that way perhaps. But I know many pieces that I consider masterpieces that other people aren't particularly aware that they are. Beatrice and Benedict by Berlioz, I think, is one.
I'd love to say something. I love that question as well, and I'm just gonna say it in the most simple way. If it's a masterpiece to you, it's a masterpiece.
Absolutely.
That's my feeling. Is if it moves you, doesn't matter. It's yours. That's the beauty of because not every piece moves me. Not every opera is what I really want to do. I mean, I have my thing, and I hear something and I work on something. If somebody asks me to do Falstaff, Verdi, I'd do it on the sidewalk, because I love it that much. And then in Figaro, I would do it anywhere. So you kind of develop your own masterpieces if it moves you. And I think that's the beauty of that. Some analytical person can do that whole thing, but it's just personal to me. That's what
I agree
would say.
completely. No, absolutely.
Other questions from the audience? Don't be intimidated by a really good question. You can ask. Don't judge your question before you ask it.
And you can ask a bad question if you want to. Yeah.
There are no bad questions.
Exactly.
May I ask a question to them?
Sure.
So who out there really knows this piece intimately, Marriage of Figaro? Who? Okay. Have you seen it before? All of it. Great. Have you read things about it? Okay. Do you like it? Yeah. Do you like the internal parts, or do you like just the arias? The arias, right? Okay, that's just asking a question. I'm trying to get a conversation started. Yeah, why do you like it? What is it just because it's Mozart and it's got that?
You are, yep, Pat's coming.
Oh, I'm sorry. These are bright lights. I can't see.
Sorry. I think what I like about it is that it's deeply engaging at almost a root level.
Mm-hmm.
But I hate it from a storyline.
Really? Okay, I understand that. Because of the internal aspects of that period, because of the class structure, right? It has a lot to do with class structure. Is that what it is?
Not even the class structure. I don't like how the parties engage with one another, period. Even when they're speaking on the same, I guess we'll call it a level.
Okay.
I don't appreciate it. I understand there's a historical point to
Right.
it, but I also think that I don't know. I think there's a deeply almost oppressive point to the whole plot, and so it's always interesting to me to see how that's pulled out.
If I might just address that just a little bit, and you could absolutely approach the Marriage of Figaro, in a way, and really focus on. I mean, we're talking about incredibly bad behavior, unacceptable, and disgusting, and there's lots of that bad behavior. But the thing that is most interesting to me, I would say, is the theme of forgiveness that is always at play in Mozart. In fact, almost every opera you look at, he even wrote an opera about forgiveness, La Clemenza di Tito. But very specifically, the moment of, and everyone that knows this piece well will look at that moment in the last act when the Count finally, the Count, who is an abject cad, and I say that euphemistically, and just horrifying in the way he has treated not just his own wife, but every woman he runs into. He's the ultimate pervert. At the moment he's caught, and the Countess says, "I'm not like you, I forgive you." Whether that's realistic or not is one thing, but in terms of this Mozart and in terms of the music here, it's realistic in that moment, and the music is perhaps the most sublime music ever written, and it's almost got a religious quality to it. To me, I'm talking about from just listening to it, because here we have someone who's no better than Don Giovanni. He wasn't, I'm sure the Count wasn't keeping track of whether he had 1,003 in Spain, but he may have. But we get to this moment, and the Contessa forgives him, and the music is, and then just how it spreads throughout the community, all of these people. I understand exactly what you're saying, and of course, as a comedy, these kinds of things, you're poking fun about something that is much more serious than that it seems like it's doing. But it is that theme of forgiveness to me that is absolutely sublime.
Thanks for sharing that, though.
I just want to comment on an article that is in our study guide for this opera that's on the blog as of today. Has a really interesting space about it, about the stories and the plays, the Marivaux trilogy that this opera is based on, and that comedy as social commentary. And I think what you're talking about and highlighting from that really speaks to that idea of comedy being used to address those things that are horrible and are not good, and it's oppressive, and it's an oppressive situation. So thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate it. Other questions? We'll go back to my list of questions then, okay. and you can ponder your own questions. My question would be one for each of you. What is something that is part of this production that you want to share with this audience so that when they come and see the opera, because they've been part of this conversation, they watch for or listen for or think about differently?
I'll give something away. Well, I mean, this is one of my favorite parts of this show, and yes, it was a part of the movie in my head, but the first thing I do when I get asked to direct a production of this, I call the conductor. I call him on the phone, and I say, hey, do you mind if I stage the second half of the overture? Because I want to make sure that it's something okay with them. Because I created this whole staging for the second incantation of diddle-dum, diddle-dum. So you get to hear it once with the orchestra, and when it recaps, I heard it, I was listening to it, and I just kept listening to it over and over, and the movie in my head was able to introduce every single character in the show with a thematic aspect. Because when we go, what happens in the beginning of the show, we find that Figaro and Susanna, Figaro has picked this new room in the home that is right in between the Countess's room and the Count's room. So it's really, really convenient for both of them. And so, basically we create this room with different aspects of music and all on the musical beat. So it's very choreographed and it's very fun. All the actors come in and the ensemble comes in and the people. So we meet all the characters in their kind of zany way. But I had to do it. I just had to do it when I listened to the overture because I heard these musical fast passages and okay, that feels like Cherubino chasing Barbarina, so it has to be. So I created those little things. And it brings me immense joy to stage it and to do it. And it's something that not everybody does. So that's my little stamp on the beginning of the show. So
I'd like to draw attention to our wonderful harpsichord player, a young man named Michael Sherman, that Sean Kelly, before he left, procured his services. He's a young American who lives in Germany and plays for Bayerischen Staatsoper in Munich, but really blessed to have him. So these accompanied recitals, not accompanied, the secco recitals, which means dry, they can be very dry if they're not done well. And the harpsichord part are just chords, bum, bum, jim, jum, jum. And the thing about Michael and with other good harpsichordists, they become part of the drama by how they improvise with how they play the secco recitativo. And I've just been so thrilled with how Michael has really taken that aspect of his job in rehearsal. So he's there in rehearsal paying attention to what's going on stage, and if something happens here, he'll put a little something in there. It's not written in the music, it's a response. So it should seem natural, and I think it will, but I'd like to call your attention to it when you're at the performance, just to appreciate how clever and how part of the dramatic flow our harpsichord players, because he's really doing a beautiful job pointing out all those kinds of things.
And I can even ask, even me on the other side, to say, can we have a little longer tinkle, 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 because I have an actor coming in through a door, and so he's able to do those things. So it's incredible, and it does add an immense amount of color to the drama. So.
Excellent. Thank you for those two things that now all of you can watch for and listen for. Before we close, I want to give one more opportunity for questions, comments, things you want to know more about. Pat's coming.
Thank you. Okay, so let's see if I can ask this question. Maestro, Dean, so you've mentioned religion a couple of times. You've mentioned the scriptural, how old and how great this opera is. Then we had a wonderful question from this woman in the back, and I'm thinking to myself, so every time you've done this opera, there's something that you read in this scripture. If you and I go in and read a story of the Last Supper, we may say, this is the most important thing to talk about. Well, now opera in general is changing a little bit. People want to talk about this. They want to talk about exactly what Mozart was doing. How do you bring that balance? How do you, in 1984 and 1996, Dean, you might have put on this opera with focusing on something else. How do you teach yourself to focus on something new?
Oh, that's an interesting question as well. What I would say is that, so take for example Don Giovanni. People say, well, Don Giovanni, he's glorified. Well, I also point out, well, he goes to hell at the end. And other people will look at Carmen, for example, and say, how that here, this is a man murdering a woman. And the violence, and I also say that in a piece like Carmen, which is very much a verismo type opera, a French verismo prototype, the squalor of Carmen I find incredibly real. Having lived in Chicago and other places where you hear about this kind of domestic violence, I mean, it's absolutely tragic. Now, if a composer or a work of art were glorifying that, that would be anathema to me. I think that in all of these things that we are doing that are dealing with difficult subjects where the treatment is not as up to date and progressive in the best possible sense, I think it's our duty to make certain that we emphasize those things that show the reality. So, for example, in the Marriage of Figaro, we make it pretty clear that the Count is very much a bad person in what he does, and that while the story revolves around all this interplay of stuff, it's very, very obvious to me at the end what is happening in terms of forgiveness, and for the fact that and what people don't realize is that this great moment of where the Countess forgives him, and the Countess is our hero. We go on to read the third of the Beaumarchais things, and we find out that the Countess had a child with Cherubino, and so at a certain degree there's life, but I don't know. I am not a creative artist in the sense that, I mean, I'm a recreative artist. And for me, from an artistic standpoint, even if it's a new opera about the loftiest social goals, and there are operas that are just marvelous and really great operas, but to me, unless it's great art, then it's not serving that. It's not serving that as well. That's one of the things I love so much about this Glory Denied that we just did, which is an incredibly important story about something more nearly contemporary, which still hits home today. But it's a great piece of art, and I think that so that's what I'm looking for. And it's not so much that I feel as though it's my job to make social commentary in my recreating the score, if that makes sense. That's not my job. The last thing I would want to do would be to offend anybody or anything at all like that. But it is an interesting time that we're living in, and it's wonderful. I mean, I'm thrilled to death that the consciousness of the creators of opera and the creators of art and the creators of music and everywhere are finding good reasons to sort of highlight some of the kinds of things. I mean, we all know exactly what we're talking about, and I think that's wonderful. But from my perspective, I'm just a musician, and I'm trying to find the art in these things.
It is a fantastic question, and I have spent the last multiple years now really being conscious of growing, changing, and realizing. And I've been in a lot of scripts that I've been working with and shows that I work in. And I have gone through these scripts and changed certain words that were dated from, say, the 70s, even the musical theater pieces that I do. Man, La Mancha, some of the just words from that era, they're not necessary. And just to change a word that just to all the way through, just cut it out completely and use language that is appropriate and that feels right and it does. But the most important thing for me is if you make a change that changes the arc of the story, then I think you're tap dancing on some difficulty. But what I think about Figaro is that I think in Figaro, when I think about your question, I see in my head much more of the work that they do around this choice of his behavior, of the Count's behavior. I see how much work is done for the women to conspire and figure ways to do that with Figaro, to break that cycle, to not let that cycle happen. So, and much more is created around this piece about how they're going to deal with that kind of behavior than we see the behavior. Does that make sense? So for me, that's the beauty of this. And, you know, I've always just say, the women win. And then Act 4, they do. Because we see them control the situation and not say put them in their place. But, you know, when Susanna decides to play with Figaro, decides to be the Countess, and then he sees it and they play against each other and it turns out and they love each other and it's great. But the Countess and the Countess, that relationship's big. You know, and a lot of people don't know how it's going to go after that. But we do see this moment of forgiveness. But going back to that, I see more around the intrigue of the piece of how to get around dealing with his choices that could affect the rest of the show. So I don't change anything based on that, because I think that there is more about getting around his behavior. So.
And just to be clear, I mean, I've never thought adultery is good, ever. It just hasn't been, you know, the last couple of years. I mean, so some of these things are.
It also doesn't happen in the show.
Right, I know. Well, it doesn't happen in the show. That's right. I mean, you know, but there are a lot of these themes that I don't think it. I've felt for a long time that the attention that is now coming to a number of the things that we're talking about is absolutely wonderful. But for some of us, we've always felt that way. We've always been very much wanting to empower the powerless and very much opposed to the kinds of things that we're supposed to be opposed to. I should quit talking because I'm going to step into something that I don't mean to, other than to say that I totally embrace, you know, new thinking in the arts about how we try to promote women, transgenders, LGBTQ community, the racial aspects. All of that is something that we've neglected for a long, long time. And just because it hasn't risen to the top of the consciousness of the arts world until now, doesn't mean that it should be eschewed, in my view. And so I don't want there to be a conflict between the two. If that makes sense.
Thank you for that, and I think there's a wonderful, what I'm hearing from both of you is this space of it can be both. It can be the masterpiece and it can be great art, and then we can also think about it in new ways when we're watching it now in 2023, when we're working on it now in 2023, because we live in the world, and you know, art doesn't exist in a vacuum. So with that, we're past time. Sorry, everybody. That's my job, and I fell down on it to keep us on the time track. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and your wonderful comments and questions. I so appreciated this conversation. Thank you to Dean and Stephen for being here this evening. We look forward to seeing you next week at the Blackstone Theater, where we will be talking about the art of comedy. And we'll see you at the Orpheum Theater for Marriage of Figaro, and I hope we'll see you back here on April 4th so you can come back after you've seen the opera and put all of those experiences together. Thank you for being here. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Pleasure.